ICP was known as one of the biggest scams ever on release, dumping from a 60 billion market cap almost into the dust, the absolute ashes. And everyone was just saying that this was a massive scam. Everyone just got kind of ripped off. But if you kind of held through all of that, whilst you were hurting over those 2 years, you have now seen ICP rally, and there is probably one of the biggest communities behind it, really supporting it, and who just absolutely love ICP. They just can't get enough of it. They will just literally burn your house down if you just say anything bad. In this video, I'm going to be going in depth on ICP, talking about how it works, essentially what are the risks to growth for ICP, because it is a massive feat that ICP is trying to undertake, and just sort of breaking down their claims of essentially what they're offering and how they currently are right now when compared to other blockchains. Then like and subscribe to this channel, because we're going to be diving into those numbers. So in this bull market, you don't make any FOMO decisions into just buying coins because everyone's just suddenly talking about it, only to see it dump shortly later, because the projects that are going to stick around and really do well are the ones that have true narrative, are the ones that truly fit in and have real utility and use cases. Crypto's kind of moved from this kind of pump and dump scheme, because never really used to have much utility before, but we're really starting to see some incredible projects come about now, starting to grow. And these are the projects that are actually going to stick around. So anyway, let's get into it. So I've gone through the white paper, the tokenomics, the website, and all of the community forums to find out how ICP is currently running and whether what they're trying to achieve is currently seen in that current state. If you don't know, most blockchains are run on centralized infrastructure like AWS and Google Cloud, which is kind of weird considering Bitcoin and crypto in general was meant to be this decentralized thing, when pretty much all of it's just run on centralized systems. So it kind of defeats the object of crypto in the first place. And this is what ICP is looking to be essentially. But are they really doing it right now? Because what real difference is it having a blockchain if you're pretty much centralized on AWS and Google Cloud? It kind of defeats all of the purpose of crypto in the first place. So if we actually look at this blockchain on AWS, we can see that 25% of all Ethereum workloads run on AWS. And I imagine a lot of it's also centralized to Google Cloud as well. And a lot of what I'm about to tell you in this video actually took me a lot of time to research, and it still doesn't quite make sense in a perfect light, but I'm going to share everything that I kind of seen on it. So we can also see as well that Bitcoin Lightning Network is 48% centralized on AWS and Google Cloud, which is absolutely huge. So basically, when a transaction is made through the Bitcoin Lightning Network, if one of the parties goes offline, then essentially the funds could be lost in the process. So obviously, to process these transactions, you need a reliable data center. So obviously by using this, and imagine as well, they're much cheaper because AWS and Google Cloud have infinite scale. Reduce any cost by a huge fraction, because these services have huge infrastructure to reduce those costs to minimize the cost of transactions when processing it. However, in theory, if the government wanted to crack down on it, it could just go to AWS or Google Cloud and get them to shut down these services that they offer to crypto, and then suddenly you're not able to process transactions on these crypto chains effectively. And this is essentially where ICP is coming in. They want to create their own data centers big enough to essentially decentralize this. So in the essence is that you would have to have so many data centers, so many nodes, in that you're not concentrated on one specific company like AWS or Google Cloud. You'd have thousands of small nodes that would all sort of work together. So if someone was able to shut down one node or a couple of nodes, you would still be able to do all of the processing with all of the other nodes, creating a much more decentralized blockchain network. And that's essentially what ICP is trying to do. Obviously, we don't know the cost of doing this. Maybe they're more expensive than AWS or Google Cloud. I haven't really found the data on that. But essentially, this would allow ICP to host things like applications, websites, anything that is hosted on AWS. So essentially, if AWS was to go down, it basically would take down around 40% of internet traffic, because obviously all those websites that were hosted on AWS, a lot of game servers, a lot of big banks servers are actually hosted on AWS. So if AWS was to go down, a lot of the services, applications, games, websites that you use would go down as well. ICP's goal is essentially to decentralize this, so not only one person has control, and then give control of the whole project to thousands of voters, which we'll talk about later. To do this, they have to create the same scalability that AWS Google Cloud offers, which obviously requires a lot of infrastructure and software to make all of these nodes work well together, which they don't essentially control. And you would need a lot of nodes in a single location for that reliability, because obviously, even though AWS obviously powers 40% of the internet, they are very reliable. But with these individual nodes, if it's a smaller mom-and-pop or something like that, you don't know how exactly reliable these are. So you would need a lot of nodes in one location, because then if a couple went down, you've still got all of the others. Create huge decentralizations and make the ICP internet much more decentralized. But they would have to get the scale there to lower costs enough for developers, because if there's only a few node operators, maybe they're charging higher or something like that. I don't know exactly how that element works, but you just need a massive economies of scale. So we'll dive into the numbers of the nodes now. So if we look at the nodes for ICP, they have 124 node providers, 81 data centers, and 1,400 data machines. I assume that these node machines are by these providers. So in theory, these are the kind of numbers that you're looking at, even though they have the node machines, which would be able to process more data and do more services. You're kind of looking at this number for the decentralization, these two numbers. And if we compare that number to Solana, we've got 2,919 nodes, 392 data centers. By comparison to those, it's got around 4 times, which obviously is quite a lot more, which isn't bad considering how much bigger Solana is. But ICP actually started in 2015, whereas Solana started in 2020. So it has actually grown a lot faster than ICP, which is interesting. But that could also be in the fact that ICP is trying to tackle multiple areas. So it's trying to create all of this decentralization nodes, as well as creating infrastructure for developers to create dApps. Whereas Solana is more of just a platform that people can kind of come and create their own stuff. So it's a little bit different in their approach. So that probably explains why Solana got a little bit further. Also, Solana, if we take a look at the Nakamoto coefficient, and I actually researched what this is, and the Nakamoto coefficient of Solana is currently 12, and this is essentially a measure of the decentralization of a proof of stake network. It basically represents the smallest number of validators that would need to collude or be compromised in order to prevent the network from functioning correctly. The higher the coefficient, the more decentralized the network is. And from my research, a validator is essentially people who upload the transactions, whereas a node is essentially the ones who basically operate the network. So in the ICP space, we get validators by people staking their tokens. So if you stake a certain amount of tokens, it creates a neuron. And in those neurons, you basically get voting rights for basically the network. With ICP, when you stake a token, you get a neuron, and depending on how much you stake is how much of a percentage of voting rights you get. And this is essentially how ICP is governed. So depending on the amount of neurons and how many people, each person has a voting percentage, and they can essentially vote on things that happen within the ICP network. And one of those important things are the nodes, and those are essentially the data centers that can come onto the ICP network. So voters basically have to approve those nodes for them to come onto the ICP network. And the hope of this is essentially to stop big nodes coming on that can maybe make the network more centralized. So it kind of creates a little bit of protection. Where I look at Solana, I believe that anyone can become a node. Correct me if I'm wrong, I couldn't find information that says otherwise. I believe anyone can become a node of Solana. But if we actually take a look at the total staked as well, this is quite interesting. So the 8 years has actually increased dramatically, whereas the actual number of staked tokens is decreasing. What I believe this to be, and I actually found some information on this, is that the early investors had their tokens staked, and a lot of those are starting to become unstaked now. It took me a while to find, but essentially the number of staked tokens is dropping. The non-dissolving's increasing, but it's the dissolving that isn't. But if we actually look, the number of neurons is massively increasing, and that means that the decentralization of the voting power is increasing, so more voters are basically having a share. So the governance of ICP is spreading out a lot more, but we essentially need to see those nodes spread out more as well. So it needs to take on a lot more nodes, because yes, these people have the voting rights of people who can come on as a node, and that maybe has slowed it down a little bit in growth. So that could be the difference between that and Solana. but you need to have a high amount of neurons and also a high amount of nodes for it to be completely decentralized. And I actually found this article here. It's actually from 2 years ago, so it might be a bit outdated now, but it's just interesting to see. But it said that 80% of ICP nodes are held by just 8 separate node provider entities, and it just shows some documentation on this, which is quite interesting. Obviously, this is in July 2022, so that may have changed now, but ICP has been around since 2015. So that's just something to take into account, that perhaps it's not actually as decentralized in terms of its node providers, but its neuron network is actually what's making it decentralized in terms of its voting rights. And the other thing I just kind of want to touch on as well, the interesting thing about the ICP network is when you're interacting with the apps, you don't actually have to pay a fee to use them. It uses a reverse gas fee, so essentially the developer would essentially pay that fee instead of you. So it kind of acts like using the usual internet, where you just don't pay to go to a website or use an application or anything like that. And you can see that by canisters. So canisters are essentially prepaid compute power by the developers, so they can essentially run their apps on the ICP network, and that is dramatically increasing, which is interesting. But in theory, if they are running something on there, they're going to need to make money somehow. So it's going to be a subscription fee. Maybe it's like an e-commerce, maybe it's an application that you have to pay for. So yeah, you don't have to pay gas fees to use it, but you're still going to be paying one way or another with your wallet. So that's just interesting in a sense. Again, a lot of this is very intense amounts of information to take in, and some bits I don't completely understand perfectly yet, but I definitely have delved into this a lot. The interesting thing is that obviously a lot more people are staking for 8 years, so that kind of shows that a lot of people are going long in this project. A lot of the ones that are being unstaked are the shorter term periods, and that is kind of interesting. But the one thing I will say is that you actually get a massive annualized return for staking for a long period. So I kind of feel like a lot of people are pushed for that as well. People love their percentage returns. That's kind of why partly people held all their money on the FTX platform. People love that percentage guaranteed return, and I don't really see many offering any higher than ICP with such a promising project. So partly I would say it's due to that, and partly I would say perhaps it's due to people going long on this project. But where do I see ICP in terms of a competitor to the Layer 1 blockchains? Because that's essentially what it is. And it's very hard to say, because in theory, yes, ICP has a unique approach in that respect. I don't really see anything super unique about it, except it's trying to be more decentralized. But Solana is heading in that direction as well. It is becoming more decentralized as more of these nodes naturally come on, and more validators come on as well. It's going to be difficult to take market share from these, and it has a lot of headwinds in doing so. But it is building such a diehard community, and I do think it's going to have some runway in this bull market. But I don't know if it can really compete at the level of Solana. It really depends on the adoption. If Solana gets fully adopted, then it might struggle quite a bit, but there might be a place for ICP in certain aspects we don't actually know yet. Nonetheless, it is a very cool project. The other problem I see about this whole decentralized node thing is that they don't own the internet cables and systems that they're running on. So Amazon actually lays its own cables under the ocean as well to basically own the whole journey, whereas ICP would be getting it from the telecommunications providers to basically use the internet exchange between those nodes. So they don't own that, so they're still technically at the mercy of someone. It's not completely decentralized in that aspect. If someone wanted to come after them and shut them down, they could just go to the telecoms communication providers and just say, like, stop letting these people use your network, and then ICP would have to start laying layers of cable. And I know it's not an intended pun, but they would have to lay a lot of cable, and that's damn expensive. I do feel like they're technically at the mercy of someone, so it's kind of difficult for them in that aspect. But it's definitely one of the most ambitious projects in crypto right now. Probably is the most ambitious. I don't think it's the safest investment, but it is one of the most ambitious investments. So if you're going to invest in it, I would say maybe a maximum of 10% of your portfolio. there is other projects like Solana which are going to give you a much better guaranteed return in this bull market. I think potentially in the next bull market, ICP could see some huge gains if it really does fulfill on what it's trying to do and the numbers start to make a little bit more sense. Maybe it's got a ton more node providers, that governance really starts to prove, or maybe we see some regulation in some way test the other blockchains in ways that ICP can handle. So I think there's a lot of potential in the long term. I think in this bull market, you're gonna be much safer with other projects as a higher rate of return, but I wouldn't write it off completely. It's not a bad project, but it's definitely one of the riskier bets of the top market cap coins. However, if you're in it for the long term, 15% annualized returns and also seeing the upside of the coin is definitely a reward not to shy away from, but you would miss the gains on this bull market if you are locking those tokens away for 8 years. You could just ride it up, sell, and then just buy again in the next bull market. Is the 15% really that worth it? I don't know. That's for you to decide. Do the maths on it. It depends if you just want to lock your money away and not think about it, because generally active day trading isn't the best. But I think we've got a lot of run in this bull market. ICP could be a good project. Again, just keep it to 10%, but I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Maybe you guys can kind of correct me on my research on this, because there is a lot. It's very complicated. So, but if you did like the video, guys, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.